Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on Cowboy Storytime, we ride the stories of the West campfire, truth's trail dust memories, saloon whispers. Gritty humans, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The wind did not howl, it screamed. It came off Wolf's ledge and drove needles through cloth and skin. Snow lifted in sheets and closed again, swallowing the trail, the trees, the world. Mara Whitlow leaned into it and kept moving. Her lashes were rimmed white. Her breath tasted like pennies and pine. Each step pulled at her hips. The swell beneath her dress was a hard, round weight that dictated the angle of her back and the speed of her feet. She held it low with one hand through the wool and told herself to count. 5 steps. Breathe. 5 more. Breathe. Above her, a single wire ran from ridge to ridge, dark against the blank sky. It sang a thin metallic whine in the gusts. Somewhere far off, men traded words by spark. Here, the only language was cold. Her boots sank and did not find bottom. She went to her knee, then to both, and the snow came over her waist. Cloth went wet and heavy in an instant. She twisted to pull free and felt the cramps start deep and mean. She froze until it passed. The pain left a greasy aftertaste in her mouth. She wiped her lips with a numb fist, and forced herself out of the drift. When she stood, she could not feel her feet. They might have been stones tied to her ankles. There was no sky, only white brightness. No ground, only white weight. No sound but the wire, the wind, and her own breath thin and tearing. She tried to picture heat, her mother's stove, a tin cup that burned the tongue. The picture would not hold. The second drift caught her shin and rolled her. The third took her breath. She lay on her side cheek to pout her eyes open to a world that had no edges. Snow crept into her collar. Her teeth clicked. The baby turned a slow push under her palm. She spoke to no one and to everything. "I am pregnant," she said. Her lips cracked on the P. The wind took the rest. 100 yards downslope, a man on a shaggy mule stopped at the sight of color in a place that had none. Calico dark and wrong against new snow. Jonah Rook shifted in the saddle and watched. Hob blew steam and stamped. The old mule's ears went flat, then forward again. Jonah tugged his scarf up to his eyes and sat still until the cold reached his bones. It could be a trick. It could be a corpse. It could be nothing that mattered to him. He clicked his tongue and turned Hob's head for home. The mule resisted. Jonah cussed, changed his mind, and swung down into the drift. Snow came to mid-thigh. He moved with a slow, practiced economy, one hand on Hob's lead rope, the other parting the surface like a swimmer. Up close, the calico was a dress. Under it, a woman. Young, lips the color of old fish. Frost dusted the down on her cheekbones. Her hands were wrapped in the ruins of gloves. Her belly was unmistakable. His jaw set. The world never came to him empty. It brought debts and mouths and trouble that needed feeding. He put it all aside and got to work. He stripped the buffalo coat from behind the saddle. The hide was stiff with cold and held the ground smell of animal and smoke. He wrapped her in it, breast uncovered and lifted. She was nothing in his arms, a bundle of frozen sticks with a small fire hidden at the core. He got her across the saddle in front of him, belly turned toward his chest, so the horn would not bruise the child. Her head fell against his collarbone. He could feel the ice in her hair through his flannel. "Breathe through your nose," he said, though he knew she could not hear him. Slow. Hob took the slope in short, determined steps. The wind cut at their faces and pushed ice under collars and cuffs. Jonah kept one arm caged around the woman and steered with the other. Pines loomed and went black in the gusts, then vanished in white again. He tasted the creak in the air before he heard it, the low grind of water under a lid of ice. They crossed at the shallow riffle by the bent cottonwood, where he had cut steps into the bank in autumn. The mule took them one at a time, legs splayed careful as a cat. Past the creek, the ground rose. The path to the door was a trough he had shoveled in and stomped a dozen times since the last storm. The cabin squatted in a drift, with only the roof and the stovepipe sure above the world. Smoke came at a slant and disappeared. The wire was gone here. Only trees and the line where he had stacked cordwood showed against white. He slid from the saddle and took the woman in his arms again. Hob shook and snorted, impatient to be done. Jonah shouldered the door with his hip and kicked snow out of the jam with his boot heel. The warm hit him in the face like a wall. Inside was all red light and breath. The iron stove glowed at the seams. The air tasted of venison and tallow and tea. Leather hung from pegs dark with oil. Bundles of sage were tied to a rafter. The floor was swept to hard dirt and a fur was thrown over the cot. He set her near the hearth on the bearskin and peeled the coat back. Steam lifted off the wet shawl on her shoulders. The skin at her throat went pink where the heat found it. He touched a finger to her cheek and got a response he could not name. Not a flinch, not yet awareness, just a small shift toward warmth. Her eyes opened a crack. They were the pale brown of creek water under ice. Where she rasped. "You are inside," he said. "Nothing more." He tore strips from a clean shirt that had already been washed thin by years of work. He wound them around her hands to keep the fingers from sticking to each other as they thawed. He took her boots off and set them by the stove. Her stockings were a horror. He cut them away and covered her feet in dry wool, and then in the buffalo coat. He did the work without looking at her face. "Name," he said at last. "Mara," she said barely. "Whitlow." He nodded once. He dipped a tin cup into the pot on the back of the stove and waited until the broth stopped scalding. He brought it to her mouth. She tried to lift her hands and could not. He did not sigh. He got a shoulder under her and helped her enough to drink. She swallowed and coughed and swallowed again. Fat and salt and heat went down and brought her back an inch. Her gaze moved over the room as if it were a map. Pelts, a shelf with cartridges in a row, a three-legged stool, a small book propped against a tin frame above the hearth. The draft fluttered a page and showed a pressed flower. Mara's teeth stopped chattering. Her eyes closed. He eased her back and pulled the furs higher. Outside wind clawed at the door and rattled the latch. Inside the stove ticked as sap bled from a split log. Jonah took Hobb's halter and stepped back into the white to stable the mule in the lean-to. He forked hay, checked the water hole in the barrel, and rubbed the animal's ears until Hobb leaned into his palm and sighed. He shut the gate and turned for the cabin, with his scarf pulled high and his head down. In the yard, the snow was already filling his prints. The wire on the ridge sang on a key he could not place. He went inside and dropped the bar. He knocked ice out of the boot heels on the threshold with the spine of his knife. He fed the fire. He stood still a long time with his hands open toward the heat. The woman slept if it could be called sleep. He could see the small motion of her breath under the furs. He took off his gloves and laid them on the stove's back to warm. The scar across his chest itched where the heat reached it. The room smelled of iron ash and broth, the three things that marked a winter you could live through. He sat on the stool and set his knife on the stone. The blade kissed grit. The sound was steady and clean, a thin music that belonged to this place. The fire answered. The wind pressed at the chinking and failed to get in. Mara stirred. Her hand slid to the swell of her belly and stayed there. Her face softened a fraction. Jonah kept his eyes on the steel and pulled the edge true. The world stayed outside. The light in the room changed from fire red to low pewter and back again. The stove ticked. The kettle rattled once and settled. Mara drifted up through the warmth and ache and opened her eyes to the seam glow of iron and the shape of a man between her and the door. Jonah Rook had a tin cup in his hand. Steam curled in the air and carried the smell of bones and sage. He did not speak until she blinked at him. "Drink," he said. Her hands were clumsy under the wrappings. He slid an arm behind her shoulders and lifted just enough. The cup touched her mouth. Fat and salt went down and spoke to muscles that had forgotten their work. She coughed, swallowed again, then sagged against the fur. "How long?" she said. "Hours. Maybe a night," he said. "You went stiff on me. Not much to do, but heat." She found the shape of his name without asking for it. It did not come. He set the cup on the hearthstones and reached for a split of pine. He fed the fire with a care that looked like habit and religion both. The flames licked and changed their voice. He opened the stove door wide enough to show her the coal of it. "Look," he said. "These are what matter. Bank them right, and you keep breath in the box, even when you sleep." He scooped ash with a small, flat shovel and sifted it over the live coals until they glowed as if frowned at. He added a wedge of oak that had been kept back for deep nights. "Pine is for quick heat," he said. "Oak stays. If you smother the coals, you start from nothing. Do not start from nothing." Her mouth was dry. "I can try," she said. He closed the door and latched it with a knuckle later. He moved through the room with the kind of care that wastes nothing. Leather spoke when he touched it. The rack that held his rifle clicked once and went quiet. He set a small pot on the back of the stove and filled it with a dipper from the kettle. She watched the surface tremble. "I can melt snow," she offered. "Water." He looked at her from under his brow and then at the pot. "You leave a thumb of water in the bottom," he said. "Always. Snow in a dry, hot pot pops it. Then we drink ice and chew until our teeth break." "I understand," she said. The wind pressed at the seams of the cabin and failed to get in. A draft stirred a page above the hearth. A small book was propped beside a tin frame that held a picture nobody had moved in a long time. The book opened on a pressed white flower with 3 clean petals. Mara looked and then looked away. Her eyes found the dirt floor and the sweep marks that ran from door to stove and back to door. The room smelled like tallow and gun oil and meat. It was clean in the way that a workshop is clean. "Food," he said. "You will need something more than broth." She nodded. "I can peel," she said, "if you show me where." He watched her for the length of a breath. Suspicion and calculation moved in his eyes and did not reach his mouth. He lifted a plank near the table by a knotted rope handle and set it aside. Cold air breathed out of the hole. The root cellar lay under the floor, boxed in with tongue board and lined with straw. Potatoes lay in the dark like dull moons. Carrots waited with their tops clipped to red stubble. On a shelf above them, a jar glowed with summer beans held in brine. He brought up 4 potatoes and a small curved knife with a honed silvered edge. He set them on the table with a block of wood for a board. "Only the bad skins," he said. "Do not chase the blade, let it walk." Her fingers felt like someone else's at first. The knife bit skated came back. Skin laced the board in curls. She missed and left a strip of peel. She went back and took only what was needed. He said nothing. When she finished, he took the bowl without comment and salted the water in the pot with a measured pinch. Hobbs' bridle hung from a peg and dripped melted ice. The animal blew once in the lean-to and scraped wood with a hoof. Jonah cocked an ear and listened. The corner of his mouth moved as if he had answered and did not bother with words. She tried to sit up higher. He came and tugged the furs behind her shoulders. The touch was practical and careful. He did not meet her eyes. "Thank you," she said. He poured the peeled potatoes into the pot. The water climbed to a simmer and made small sounds at the lid. He counted in his head and then took the lid off. Steam ballooned. He crushed a pinch of dried leaves between his fingers and dropped them in. The smell shifted to something that woke memory. She could not hold a kitchen with a window that had been washed by hands she no longer had. Her throat closed. She blinked, and the heat from the pot made more water come. "Do you have a name?" she said, and then corrected herself. "I mean, I did not ask yours." He did not turn. "Rook," he said. "Jonah." She tested the sound and kept it to herself. He stirred with the back of a wooden spoon, checked the heat with his palm at the side of the pot, then slid the spoon across to her. "Taste," he said. "Tell me if it needs salt." Her mouth was clumsy, but the broth and the potato together made something that felt like a floor under her. She nodded. "It is good," she said. "It is enough." He took the spoon back with a hand that had scars over the knuckles and a raw patch where rope had burned. He set 2 bowls on the table, put one on the hearth for her, and sat on a low stool. They ate with the sound of the wind and the small noises a house makes when it is cold and alive. After he showed her where he kept salt in a lidded tin and where beans sat in a cotton sack tied with a loop of leather. He opened a drawer and took out 2 squares of calico folded and clean and put them near the hearthstones. "For hands after thaw," he said. "Skin comes back stubborn." She nodded and tucked her wrapped fingers into the warm cloth and felt sensation creep and sting. Pain meant blood moving. It startled her and eased her both. On the mantel, the pressed flour lifted its edges in the draft and settled again. Jonah reached up and steadied the page with a fingertip. Behind the book lay a folded paper yellow at the creases. He pulled it free and held it above the stove lid a moment, as if the heat could read it. His jaw worked. He folded it once more and slid it back under the book. Mara watched without asking. The question formed and sat in her mouth and did not leave. Her breath found a rhythm that matched the stove's tick. He stoked the fire once more and shook the ash down through the grate. He showed her how he packed the coals for night, a layer of ash like a blanket so thin a breath could get through it. He took a splinter from the cordwood stack and shaved kindling with fast, clean strokes. The shavings fell like ribbons and smelled green even in winter. He set the bar across the door and checked the latch on the window. He set his rifle in its spot and laid a block of wood against the leg of the table so it would not rock. He moved as if it had always been done in that order. She pulled the furs up to her chin and listened. Hobbs shifted in the lean-to. The creek ground its quiet music under ice. The wire on the ridge sang a thin note she could not place. "Sleep," he said. She closed her eyes. The room kept its red pulse. The flower did not move again. The world stayed where he had decided to put it. Dawn came thin and pewter, a weak light that made the window look like a blind eye. The stove held its red heart under ash. The room was warm enough to keep breath soft and quiet. Mara woke with a start and a sting in her palms. A room swam in front of her that was not this one. Velvet drapes heavy with dust, a decanter and 2 cut glasses on a tray, the smell of bay rum and old smoke, a man's hand closing on her wrist. Barnaby Sloane's voice pitched soft for company and hard for her. Wild filly. Debt that walks. The floor tilted. She dragged herself up from that carpet and into the smell of tallow and tea. Her mouth was dry. She lay still and listened. Hob shifted in the lean-to and blew. Outside, the wind ran its hands along the chinking and found no purchase. Inside, the kettle clicked once and was still. Jonah stood by the wash basin with sleeves rolled. He poured melted snow from a small pot and hissed when it hit the metal. Steam lifted and fogged his beard. He dipped a rag and rubbed at his chest in quick workman strokes. The skin showed pale under hair. Then the ropey line of an old cut that crossed him from collar to ribs and went on out of sight. Puckered marks around it told a story she did not know yet. A round scar sat near the shoulder, like a coin buried under skin. He felt her eyes and glanced once. No shame, no pride, only a stillness that could turn either way. He reached for a shirt and pulled it on, slow, careful not to catch on the band of scar. The cloth hid the map, but not the weight of it. Morning, she said, because there was nothing else to put in the air. He nodded. You sleep. A sort, she said. He took the kettle off the back of the stove and poured the water into the basin he had just used, testing the heat with the back of his knuckles. Wash, he said. Not long, warm only. No hot for frostbit hands. She sat up. The wraps on her fingers had gone spotted where thaw met old bruise. He unwound them with a care that touched only cloth and never skin. He set the rags on the hearthstones to dry. She dipped the cloth he gave her and ran it over her face, her throat behind her ears. The warmth reached parts that had forgotten they were her. It brought a prickle to her cheeks. She breathed in and out and let her shoulders drop. On the mantel, the small book stood as it had last night, propped against a tin frame. The draft from the flue lifted a page and put it down again. The pressed white flower looked like a star that had fallen onto paper. The tin frame held a picture no bigger than a palm. A young face with a half-smile hair, not yet made to heal eyes that had not seen winter like this one. Who is he? She asked. Her voice made the question gentle. Jonah dried his hands on his trousers and did not answer for a breath. Caleb, he said. My brother. Her eyes went back to the flower. He pressed that she said more to the room than to him. He drew them, Jonah said. He tapped the book's spine. Flowers, leaves, vines by the creek. When it warms they come through snow like they do not know they are small. He liked gentler things, she said. He looked at the fire. He did. There was a fold of paper under the book. Jonah slid it out with 2 fingers and held it up. The creases were soft from being opened and shut too often. He held it above the stove lid where heat could lick it without taking it. His jaw worked once. He folded the paper again and put it back where it lived. Mara touched the edge of the blanket with her wrapped fingers and did not press. I had a house once, she said, and the words surprised her as they came. A front window with lace, a clock that chimed 4 minutes late. He came and put his coat on the chair and never hung it. He spoke money like a language. He called me girl when he was alone and miss when there were eyes. Barnaby Sloane, Jonah said, not as a question. She looked up. His face did not change. She nodded. He bought what my father could not pay. He liked to tell me what I owed. He took that in and left it where she had set it. He did not ask for more and did not look away from her. The silence felt like a blanket pulled up to the chin. The day moved in small chores. He pulled the bar from the door and stepped into a white that had lost the edge of anger and settled into weight. He shoveled a path to the lean-to and checked Hobbs' hooves packed with ice and hard bells that needed breaking. He forked hay and tapped the barrel with his knuckles to hear water in it. He came back with a branch under his arm and a pocket full of the things a man picks up out of habit. A bent nail he would straighten, a length of sinew he would save, a stone flat enough to sit a pot on. She watched his hands. They were big without softness. The rope burn across the base of the fingers was new. The scar over the knuckles was old. When he set the branch on the table and shaved off curls to test the grain, the knife moved like a thought he had before words. Is there mending? She asked. I can sew. He looked at her hands and then at a bundle on a peg. He took down a pair of gloves with seams blown at the thumb and handed them over with a bone needle and a twist of thread. She set the glove on her lap and matched edges. The first stitch bit her finger through the wrap and made her hiss. She adjusted. After a few passes, the needle went where she asked it to. The glove took the thread and closed on itself, making a seam that would not win prizes and would not split when wood asked for more work than a hand should give. He watched once from the corner of his eye and then went back to the branch. He shaved the bark, turned the piece in his fingers, and made a notch with the tip of the blade the way a man does when he is thinking of nothing and something at the same time. She found herself making a small sound in her throat while she worked. It started as breath given a shape and grew into a tune without a name. A line from years when there was a roof that kept rain honest and a mother who stood at a sink with her sleeves rolled and sang under it. The note ran across the room and settled, not timid, not bold, only there. Jonah's knife paused at the end of a stroke. The blade hung a beat and then moved again. He did not look at her. "Sorry," she said. He shook his head. "Not a bad thing," he said. He set the branch aside as if it had told him it was done for now. He took his rifle and checked the action with care that made no sound. He moved to the door and lifted the bar. "Back in a bit," he said. She nodded and went back to the glove. The thread rasped through leather. The kettle breathed. He returned with snow on his shoulders and a look that had more thought in it. He set the rifle in its place and put his fingers on the post by the door where the wood had been scored high. 4 long marks pulled rough through the grain, as if a hand with nails had dragged there. He ran his thumb across them and felt the raised edges. He did not name what made them. He wedged a heavier stick against the lean-to-gate and checked the hinge that had started to complain. He set a pan of snow on the stove back to melt. He made coffee and poured a half cup for himself and a few swallows of hot water into a tin for her. She held the warm and let it sink into her fingers through the metal. He drank his coffee and looked at the window as if he could see through the drift. "You keep that needle," he said. "There is a shirt with a collar that goes at me every morning." She lifted the glove and turned it to show him the seam. "It will hold," she said. He nodded once. "It will." Lunch was bread from yesterday and a fry of the potatoes with fat and salt. He slid the plate to her and sat where he could see both door and window without moving his neck. Habit lives in the bones of a man who has been taught by winter and other men. They ate without hurry. She took the last bite and felt it settle like a small kindness. Her eyes went back to the picture on the mantel. The young face did not change. The pressed flower did not move. The folded paper waited under the book. "Tell me about him," she said. "Caleb?" Jonah picked a crumb off his plate with a dry finger and rolled it into nothing. He thought a long time and then spoke to the picture as much as to her. He drew what he saw, he said, made it better than it was. He liked lines that curved and kept on. He read. He kept seeds in his pocket like a boy carries marbles. She listened and put the name in her pocket with her own. He would have liked a window with lace, she said. Jonah allowed a half sound that was not a laugh and not sorrow. He would have cut the lace to make room for the view, he said. He reached up and straightened the book again, not that it needed it. The light outside shifted from pewter to something more like milk. The wind ran softer fingers along the walls. The wire on the ridge gave a thin voice that did not quite reach them. Mara's needle moved in and out. She hummed without thinking. Jonah's knife made a few more quiet cuts and then went still. The fire kept its work. The pressed flower held its place on the page. The room took their sounds and made them part of itself. The day went pale and quiet. By afternoon, the light was the color of tin, and the air felt thin enough to snap. Mara tried to thread a needle and could not make her fingers obey. A chill started under her skin and ran in waves. She pulled the fur up and thought it would pass. It did not pass. Her teeth began to click. The breath in her chest shortened and turned sharp. Heat climbed her face, then left it all at once. She swallowed and tasted iron. The room swam and steadied and swam again. Jonah was at the table shaping a notch into a length of aspen. He looked over once then again with the kind of attention a man gives a sound he does not like in the night. He set the knife down and crossed the room in 3 steps. "Cold," she said. The word came in pieces. He touched the backs of his fingers to her cheek. It was hot enough to sting. He went to the stove and fed it pine until the seam glowed bright as a brand. He took willow bark from a tin and crushed it in his palm. He poured water from the kettle and let the bark steep until the cabin smelled bitter and clean. He lifted her and held the cup to her lips. She swallowed it and gagged and forced more down. Her hands shook so hard the blanket rustled on its own. Her eyes went flat and glassy. The baby rolled under her palm as if pressed by a slow wave. She made a sound that was not a word. The chill rose again and shook her. Jonah spoke low and even. "Breathe through your nose," he said. "Slow." He piled every pelt in the room across her, and still the shiver ran. He set the kettle back on the heat. He dipped a cloth and wiped her face and neck until sweat mixed with the water and ran. He fed pine, then oak, and then more pine because speed was what he could buy. She arched with a sudden cramp and pushed at the air. "Do not let him," she said. The name did not come. The meaning did. Jonah stood very still. Outside, the wind scoured the walls. Inside, the stove ticked and hummed and could not do the one thing needed. He moved to the door and barred it, as if that could keep out fever. He took off his boots and set them side by side on the hearth. He pulled his shirt over his head and shook loose the heat trapped in its weave. Pale light found the old scar on his chest and laid it bare. He slid the furs back and set a hand to the hollow of her back. "Move," he said, and his voice was gentler than he liked. "Make room." She did not understand. He lifted her with care, turned her onto her side, and slid in behind her on the narrow cot. The frame complained and settled. He pulled her back to his chest and pinned her between his forearm and the mattress. He brought the furs up around both of them, until only the top of her head showed. He tucked the edges in at her spine, her hips, her knees the way a man traps heat in a stove at night. She went stiff as a board against him, then softer, then stiff again when another wave hit. Her hands pushed weakly at his arm. He did not let go. "Easy," he said into her hair. "I am not him. Be still. Breathe with me." He breathed slow. He made his ribs into a metronome and asked her body to listen. She tried to follow and lost it, tried again and found it for a beat, lost it again. He felt each tremor through bone and muscle. The top of her head fit under his chin. Her braid smelled like smoke and lye, and something faint that might have been lavender long ago. Minutes had the weight of hours. The room narrowed to the press of two bodies, the red light from the stove, and the sound of air going in and out of two mouths. He felt the child through the line of her belly, a slow push against his own stomach, as if to say, "I am here." He tightened his arm when she shook. He loosened it when she sighed. He did not move for anything else. The chill ran its course and left heat in its wake. Her skin went from cold marble to warm stone. Sweat filled the collar of his undershirt and stung the old scar. He did not shift. He did not speak unless she drifted. "Stay," she whispered once into his chest, not sure to whom she spoke. "I am here," he said, and found that his voice did not break on it. Near dawn, the fever crested. He felt it like a tide rolling under his forearm. Her trembling slowed and stopped. Her breath deepened. A damp heat broke across her skin and turned the fur humid. He stayed where he was and counted 20, then 20 more. The cabin dimmed, and then gained a small gray light that made edges appear where there had been none. She slept like a person pulled out of water. He peeled the furs back a hand's width and wiped her face with a cloth wrung cool. He eased himself out from behind her and stood by the stove, hands on his hips, chest rising and falling, as if he had worked a field. He looked at her and saw not the girl who could not hold a spoon, not the woman who had spoken a man's name like a curse, but a shape softened by warmth. The room was quiet in the way of a place that had put out a fire without smoke. He went to the door and cracked it open an inch. The world outside was white and blue and hard. He drew it in and let it go. When he turned back, the light had found a way through the snow at the window. It came like a blade of gold and laid itself across the room. It hit the side of Mara's hair and turned brown to copper. It touched her cheek and woke a faint color there. It lit the pressed flower on the open page above the hearth and made the white of it glow against old paper. Jonah stopped where he was and forgot to breathe for a beat. He felt something in his chest give. He closed the door and set the bar without looking. He put his shirt back on and then took it off because the cloth felt wrong. He found another and pulled it over his head in one motion, as if moving faster could set the air back in order. He needed work. He took the knife and a small block of aspen from the shelf. He sat on the stool in the corner where the light could not accuse him. He cut away chips in a slow rain and turned the wood in his hands. He checked the fit against his palm, then imagined another hand and shaved the handle smaller, thinner, smoother. The bowl he hollowed with patience until it was deep and easy to fill and not too big for a mouth still learning to want food. He set the point of the knife and drew a small curve along the handle. Another curve crossed it. 3 petals found each other. Trillium. He sanded the edges with a scrap of leather until the lines were soft enough to be touched without thought. He turned the spoon in the light and waited for it to tell him it was done. He set it by her bowl on the hearth and did not look to see if she saw it. When she woke, the room smelled of coffee and wet wool. Her skin had cooled. Her hair was damp. Her sheets clung to her. She moved, and every part of her protested. She opened her eyes and found Jonah at the stove, his back to her. He poured coffee for himself and hot water for her. "The fever broke," he said without turning. She drew a breath that went to the bottom of her lungs and came out steady. "Thank you," she said. The words were plain. They were what she had. He nodded into the steam. He brought the tin to her lips and steadied it with a hand under her head. She drank and met the heat halfway. He set the cup down within reach and stepped back. Her gaze fell on the spoon. She lifted it. The wood was smooth where a thumb wanted to rest. The little flower lived on the handle without looking proud. She looked at him and found no explanation waiting. He was staring at the fire as if it could answer for him. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is a spoon," he said too fast, and then corrected himself because the truth had been said. "Use it." He pulled on his boots and took his coat off the peg. He lifted his rifle and set it back, then took it again and changed his mind once more. He stood for a second with his hand on the latch. "Stay warm," he said. "I will bring wood." He stepped into the yard, and the cold closed over him like water. The door shut behind him. In the thin air, the sound of an axe rose and fell steady and hard, a clean answer to a night that had asked a different kind of strength. Inside the spoon lay warm in a palm. The pressed flour did not move. The stove breathed and held its red heart. The roof popped and sighed as the weight shifted. Drops fell from the eaves with hollow taps into the packed snow and drilled little wells that smoked in the cold. The path Jonah had cut to the lean-to turned dark and slick where light worked the surface. The stove breathed as it always did, but the air in the room had changed. It smelled of wet wool and sap. Jonah went to the roof with a shovel and a length of rope looped at his waist. Snow came off in slabs and slid down the pitch with a sound like cloth tearing. He moved along the ridgepole careful as a cat pushed, paused, pushed again, then climbed down and cut trenches around the walls to give the melt somewhere to go. The water found each path he made and took it with a murmur that grew and fell. He let Mara stand at the door. She pulled his coat tight under her chin and stepped out into light that made her eyes ache. The snow glared and then let her see. Pines wore wet beads on every needle. The wire above the ridge sang a thin high line that did not match the creek at all. She put her boot in the trough he had shoveled and tested the ground under it. Her knees wobbled, then held. Breath went cold into her nose and came out warmer. "Here," he said. He handed her a small armload of stove wood, split short for carrying. The bundle filled her hands and let her feel the old ache in her forearms, in a way that did not frighten. She brought it to the stack by the door and came back for more. Hobbs stood in the lean-to with his lower lip loose and his eyes half shut. Mara unknotted a scoop and brought him a measure of oats. The mule put his nose in the pan and worked breath-fogging in slow puffs. She set her palm to the coarse hair between his eyes. He leaned against it like he had earned the right. By noon, the path from door to creek ran wet and brown with the first true flow since winter shut the lid. Jonah dropped a pole across the stream to make a quick bridge and tested it with his weight. He came back up the path, boots heavy, and took a saw and a draw knife from their hooks without a word. He was gone at dawn the next day. He saddled Hob tied on a coil of rawhide and set a small wrapped bundle behind the cantle. He set his Spencer back on its pegs and left her the Winchester she had cleaned because he had set it in her hands. He worked the lever and let her hear the clean click. He shook 6 cartridges into his palm and put them beside the stove where she could see them. He looked at her, once a look that measured if she was steady, and then turned Hob toward the breaks to the south. Mara kept the fire and the pot. She mended the cuff of his shirt and fixed 2 loose buttons that had been asking for it. The cabin carried a new voice she did not expect. Water ticked down the stovepipe cap. Somewhere ice let go and fell with a dull thud. She held the spoon he carved and felt the place where his thumb had smoothed it without thinking. She washed and set it back. Night came hard and bright. The snow threw the moon back at itself and filled the room with a gray that hid nothing. She lay with her hands on her belly and listened to the roof settle. Hob moved in the lean-to and kicked once at a dream. The wire on the ridge went silent between gusts and then found its note again. He did not come that day. He came the next past dark. She heard Hob on the path and lifted the bar. Jonah filled the doorway with ice on his hat brim and nothing in his face she could read. He carried 2 lengths of aspen pale and clean, already cut to long curves that spoke of something more than poles. He set them by the woodbrule as if he had brought back bread. He stamped the yard off his boots on the threshold and breathed the room in as if checking if anything had moved while he was not there. "I kept stew," she said. He nodded and ate with his coat still on. His beard shone with melt. He did not say where he had gone. She did not ask. He slept in the chair and woke before the stove lost its color. In the morning he took the aspen outside and set up a shaving horse in the strip of sun by the wall. The wood shavings came off in long ribbons and fell cross-hatched in the mud. He turned the pieces and felt along the grain with a hand that read more than it showed. He steamed the curves over a kettle and bent them slow, holding them until they understood what was being asked. He pinned them with pegs he cut from the same wood and left them to think. Mara stood in the door with the baby held under her ribs and watched. His knife made a small, bright sound each time it moved. The aspen smelled green and sweet in a way that seemed impossible with snow at the sill. He hummed nothing. He did not need to. The wood spoke enough. She brought him water when he reached for the dipper without turning. He took it and drank and set it back. His eyes stayed on the curve. By afternoon he had 2 runners that matched and 2 uprights that did not fight them. He shaped the arm rails with care and sanded the hand places until they were clean of scrape. He fitted each tenon into its mortise and tested the wiggle until it had none. He brought the frame inside to work where he could feel the stove at his back. The chair sat in the middle of the room like a skeleton that almost knew itself. He screwed on slats he had saved for the seat, each one burnished from years leaning in a corner. They had been something else, and now they were not. He rubbed oil into the wood with a rag that had polished rifles and knives. The grain woke and lay down under his palm. He set the finished chair next to the hearth, a step back from heat that would crack it. He did not say for whom. He stepped away and looked as if measuring its place in the house. Mara came to it and set her hand on the arm. The wood felt alive. She sat. The chair rocked back and forward, and then settled to a rhythm that took its cue from her breath. The sound it made was small and right. Something in her ribcage let go one notch. She did not close her eyes. She did not speak. Jonah watched the way her shoulders dropped and turned away as if that were private. He went to the door and took his hat down. He looked at the tin on the mantel that held the folded paper. He took it and held it in his palm. He slid it into his coat. He rode up to the bend where the creek splits around a gravel bar. He tied Hob to a pinon and sat with the paper on his knee. The afternoon had gone thin. The wire on the ridge made its same old sound. He wrote a few lines with a stub pencil, quiet and exact. He read what he had written and did not move. He crumpled the page and smoothed it flat again. He set flint to a twist of grass and watched the fire take. He fed the edge of the paper to the flame and held it by a corner until it tried to burn his fingers. He dropped it. The ash skated on the skin of the water and darkened in the current. He went home and set his coat on the peg. He did not put the tin back on the mantel. A day later he took down boards he had kept for a different winter and chose from them the ones with the least knots, pine straight and pale and full of clean scent when the knife opened it. He cut rockers first and planed their bottoms smooth enough that they could not catch on a floor a man had swept. He joined sides to headboards with pegs that fit true. He sanded until his hands told him to stop. Mara worked near him. She stitched a line of small flowers in red on the hem of a curtain she had made from a flour sack. The thread kissed the cloth and pulled it into a pattern that would be there when the light went through. She did not hum every minute. When she did, the chair answered with a sound of wood thinking. The room learned them in both voices and did not mind. When the cradle took its shape, Jonah tested the rock with 2 fingers. It moved slow and straight. He set it on the floor, where a hand on the chair arm could find it without looking. He wiped a last line of oil in the grain and let the wood drink what it wanted. The pine made the cabin smell like a field that had not been cut yet. Mara came and knelt beside the cradle. She put her palm flat on the plank as if feeling for a pulse. She traced a knot with 1 finger and found it warm. She looked up at Jonah and found him not looking at her. "It is good," she said. He gave the smallest nod a man gives when the work has met its mark and does not require a speech. He lifted the cradle on one side and set a thin wedge under a leg so the rock would not go too far when she was tired. He pressed the wedge in with his thumb until it held. The evening drew the light down. The drip at the eaves slowed and then stopped, then started again in a new place. The creek went from murmur to a low run as if it had remembered its work. The wire above the ridge held its same thin tune and meant nothing inside the room. Jonah blew dust out of the chisel socket and hung the tool on its peg. He washed his hands in a tin basin and left the water brown with pine. He dried his palms on the seat of his trousers and stood a moment with his back to the fire. Mara pulled the chair a finger closer to the cradle and let it go. The runners answered. She rested a palm on her belly and felt a slow turn. The spoon on the hearth kept its place. The flower on the page above the stove was a white star that did not dim when the room went quiet. They sat in that quiet with the wood and the heat, and the small sounds of a house that had learned new work. Afternoon softened the edges of everything. Meltwater ticked down the stovepipe cap, and the creek spoke under the crust with a throatier sound. The rocking chair kept a small, private rhythm beside the cradle. Mara's hands moved in her lap, feeling for a stitch that was not there, then resting on the curve under her ribs. The room smelled of pine oil and coffee, gone warm on the back of the stove. Ajay scolded and went quiet. Hob lifted his head in the lean-to and blew once. Jonah looked up from the bench where he was stoning a chisel. He did not speak. He set the tool aside and stood so the chair and the door were both in his eye. Boots came up the churned path with a wet squeak. A man's voice called from outside, pitched easy for trade. "Rook, you keeping any silver for pelts, or you gone to living on air?" Jonah put a finger to his lips and tipped his chin. Mara rose without the chair squeaking and moved to the far side of the hearth, half in shadow, her hands quiet at her belly. Jonah lifted the bar and opened the door a hand's width with his body in it. Milo Griggs stood on the stoop with a bundle of beaver on his shoulder and foxtails tied to his belt. He had a pointed face and eyes that moved too fast. His hat was a cap of fur, cut down from something finer. He smelled of rank hide and horse. "Brought you something," Milo said. "Beaver's fat this year. River never froze right." Jonah kept the door where it was. The rifle lay easy along his forearm, muzzle down. "You can show me," he said. Milo shifted the bundle and grinned with a chip of a tooth. "You never change," he said. "Come on, let me in out of the wet. You got coffee on. I could smell it from the bend." Jonah did not move. "Put it there," he said, nodding at the sill. "I will look." Milo made a show of offense that did not stick. He shrugged, bent a little under the weight, and set the bundle in the doorway. He straightened slow and craned his neck to steal a view over Jonah's shoulder. The rocking chair sat by the fire. The cradle sat beside it. A woman stood in the half-light with a hand on the back of the chair. The bulge at her middle was plain. Milo's eyes found her widened, then slid away and back in the same breath. The look he wore was not surprise. It was arithmetic. "Well now," he said, soft as if for himself. "That is a picture." Jonah stepped out and pulled the door in behind him until it kissed the jamb. He crowded the stoop so there was no room for Milo's shoulders. The muzzle of the rifle came up an inch. It did not need to rise more. "You saw pelts," Jonah said. "You smelled coffee." "Sure," Milo said, and the grin was gone. "That is all. Look no harm in me noticing you got help keeping house." A man could go cross-eyed staring at one set of walls month after month. The telegraph wire sang high above them in the mild wind. Hob shifted and rattled the halter ring. Water dripped from the eaves between their boots and made little brown eyes in the snow. Milo kept talking because quiet did not serve him. "Funny thing in Gilt Creek," he said, as if telling news about weather. "Sheet tacked up outside the livery. Pretty little drawing. 500 for Barnaby Sloane's property brought back where she belongs." Jonah's jaw moved once. He put the rifle's cold ring against Milo's coat where ribs lived. Not hard. Just there. Milo's breath turned shallow. "You saw pelts," Jonah said again. Milo licked his lips. "All right," he said. Sure. I got no business with Sloane. He is sour at cards, and I like my teeth. I was thinking we could both be richer and both keep quiet. A man hears things. He passes them along. He cannot help it." "Help it," Jonah said. Milo nodded too fast. "I can help it. I can forget where I walked. I can say I found a different trail. I can tell the marshal I traded in the low country and froze my fingers for nothing." Jonah's eyes did not blink. The rifle did not move. "You can turn around," he said. "You can leave the pelts. You can keep your teeth." Milo tried to laugh and made a sound that died early. He put his hands out to show they were empty. "All right," he said again. His voice had gone thin. "All right." He stepped back off the stoop. The snow under the crust broke and took his heel. He caught himself on the post and grinned again because that was what his face did when it was scared. "No need to be rough," he said. Jonah did not answer. He watched Milo pick his way down the path he had not been invited to make. The man's boots set marks that filled with melt. At the bend, Milo turned without turning his head and let his eyes slide toward the cabin once more. Jonah saw the look and fixed it where it sat. "Forget the way," Jonah said. The sound of his voice made Hob prick both ears. Milo bobbed his head. "I am gone," he said, and went. The brush swallowed him a step at a time. The wire hummed and the creek talked, and the wind did its own business and stopped. Jonah stood until the last scrape of boot on ice was gone. He eased the rifle down and breathed once through his nose. He brought the pelts inside, dropped the bar, and set the bundle by the table. He did not touch the coffee. He checked the window latch, then the second, then the third he had cut himself. He ran his palm over the line where logs met and felt for air. The chinking held. Mara had not moved far. She had a damp cloth in her hand that she did not remember picking up. Her eyes were steady. "He will tell them," she said. She did not try to make it a question. Jonah looked at the cradle. He looked at the chair. He set the rifle on its pegs and slid the Winchester closer to the firing slit that was only a shade in the log seam. His face was a quiet that did not invite company. "Could be," he said. She rested her palm on her belly. The child rolled with a slow press. She swallowed against a mouth gone dry. "What do we do?" she said. Jonah lifted the pelt bundle and set it on a beam to dry. He cut the cord with his knife and shook out one skin and then another. He did not look at her while he spoke. "We eat," he said. "We keep fire. We keep our hands close." He took a split of oak and laid it on the coals. The stove's seam went brighter for a breath and settled. Outside, a crow gave a single harsh note and flew low over the drift, black on white. The room took that sound in and made room for it. Mara put the cloth back in the basin and smoothed the blanket near the chair. The pressed flower above the stove did not stir. Hob blew in the lean-to as if answering someone far off. The wire on the ridge sang its thin line at a pitch that made the window glass remember its shape. The chair rocked once on its own and was still. The world narrowed to work. Jonah pulled a long iron-bound chest from under the bed and set it on the table. The lid lifted slow. Oil and wool came up first, then steel. He laid each piece out in a careful line. Colt with a long barrel. Spencer with a smooth action that spoke when you listened close. Cartridges in a tin that rattled like small teeth. He did not look at her when he chose between them. He took the Spencer for himself. He set the Winchester by the west wall and turned the sight for her eye, not his. "Stand here," he said. She stood with her back to the log seam and the slit he had cut low and narrow. He put the rifle in her hands. It was heavier than it looked. He placed her feet. He tapped her shoulder until the butt sat against bone and not meat. "It will kick," he said. "Let it spend in the shoulder and not in your neck. Cheek to stock. Do not lift your head to see your work." She nodded. Her mouth was dry. He did not wait. They went outside to the stump behind the cabin. Snow still rode the ground in drifts, but the stump kept a dry face where sun had reached. He set a scrap of tin on it at 30 paces. The creek ran louder in its banks than it had all winter. "Point at the biggest part," he said. "Not his hat, not his hand. The part that holds his heart and lungs. Your eyes will want his face. Do not give them that." She pulled the lever. The brass slid and clicked. She lifted and found the tin a smear through the sight. She closed her eyes and fired. The Winchester kicked like a mean animal. The report rang off the trees and shook her to the core. The tin did not move. The bruised bloom began to rise under her collarbone. "Again," he said. She set her jaw and worked the lever. The second shot went wild as a stone in a pond. The third skinned bark from a fir. "It hurts," she said. The truth came out small. "Good," he said. "It means you are still here." He moved behind her and set a hand on the small of her back. He spoke where she could hear him and not feel the words as judgment. "Breathe out before you pull," he said. "Do not snatch at the trigger. Lay on it. Let it break like a twig, not a branch." She breathed. She set the sight where he told her and trusted his voice. On the 10th shot, the tin jumped and spun off the stump. The sound of it carried across the yard like a small bell. She blinked at the empty top of the stump. She did not smile. She swallowed and worked the lever again. The next bullet sent the tin skittering through sawdust. Her shoulder sang. The stock had stamped its shape into her skin. "Load," he said. "Always bring it back full." He showed her how cartridges fed from the gate and how to feel the spring with her thumb. He put her hands on the task until they knew the work without him. He took her inside and showed her the other slits he had cut between the logs, using an auger and the stubbornness of a man who has held a siege in his head for years. North wall, east wall, south. He wedged shutters over the windows and left a narrow seam below each. He moved the table to the door and upended the stools to make a waist-high wall. He set a bucket of water behind it and a stack of wood within reach. He pulled a rug and lifted a plank and set a small jar of powder and a roll of bandage on the ground by the hole and put the plank back. He set the Colt on the mantel where his hand could find it without looking. He counted cartridges with his lips shut. He put a handful in his coat pocket and another by the stove. He showed her where they lived with a point of his finger and a look that asked if she understood. She nodded each time. He did not waste a word where a touch could say more. They ate standing. jerky soaked in broth, biscuit broken and dipped. He did not drink coffee. He kept his senses clean as a knife. The day burned and fell. The stove breathed. The wire on the ridge sang in the changing light. They sat without sitting easy. Every crack of log, every shift of Hobbs' hooves, every crow call asked for a name, and did not always get one. Night came. He slept in the chair with the Spencer across his knees, and did not let the sleep take both eyes. She slept when her body ordered it and woke with the same order. When wind pushed the walls, she thought of a man's hand on her arm and knew it was only air. She set her palm on the curve under her ribs and counted breath until it steadied. On the third morning, he moved his head a fraction and lifted his hand for silence. She held hers in place on the Winchester and tried to hear what he heard. The room was a drum. At first there was nothing, then a thread that pulled at the ear. Metal hit metal somewhere out of sight. Harness. A low jingle. Leather creaked. Hoof on frozen duff. Down in the bed, he said. Coming up slow. How many, she said. 4, he said. Maybe 5. Her heart drummed so loud she thought they would hear it through the logs. He placed her at the west slit and put her eye where the trees began to climb. He stepped to the door and cocked his head like a hunter who wants the wind to speak. Do not show yourself, he said. Do not fire unless I am down. Then you do not stop. She grabbed his sleeve with her wrapped fingers. Stay inside, she said. It came out near a cry. They will burn us out, he said. I need to see them. He lifted the bar and set it gently against the wall. He pulled the door and stepped into a light that had no warmth. Snow still held in shadows. The yard was a churn of old boots and new melt. The creek ran hard. The wire on the ridge gave a single high note and lost it. They rode into the clearing and fanned as if the place had always expected them. 4 in open sight, and 1 who hung back and bled into the trees. The man who spoke wore a long duster and a hat with a bit of silver set above the brim. He did not put a badge on. He did not need one to hold himself like the one who gave orders. Jonah Rook, he called. His voice carried clean in the cold. Decker Hale, you know my name, you know my hand. I am here to collect what was bought and paid. Jonah kept the Spencer at his side. He did not rest the barrel on the rail. He did not give his aim away. He spoke as if to a neighbor across a fence. You are on my claim, he said. Turn your stock. Ride back out. Hale smiled with only his mouth. Property belongs with Barnaby Sloane, he said. The girl. The papers say she took a horse and 500 in notes. The man wants his due. She is not paper, Jonah said. Hale's second man moved his horse a pace and let his coat swing. A pistol butt showed and hit again. Hale rode forward a yard and stopped because the ground told him to. She has a debt, Hale said. You have a reputation. I will not ride off empty. Jonah's face did not change. You will, he said. You will do it breathing if you are quick. Haley's eyes shifted a fraction and took the measure of the porch. He did a thing with his mouth that was not quite a smile. You buried a boy once, he said. I heard it was a brother. I heard you would rather die than walk away again. A muscle moved in Jonah's jaw. He did not move his feet. The men on horses shifted leather talking. A bird spoke in the cottonwood and went silent. Hale's hand fell toward his hip. Jonah brought the Spencer up from the low carry and fired from the gut. The sound came 1 beat later than the flash. The man to Hale's left bucked in the saddle and spilled backward with a hole in his coat and a look like surprise at the sky. Hale dove for cover behind his horse and pulled his revolver as he landed. The other 2 broke for the woodline and fired to make noise and luck. Jonah racked the Spencer and fired again. The round thudded into a tree and ripped bark. The 4th man shot from the far edge of the clearing. The 5th, who had gone to ground, took his time and put a bullet high and tight. The impact spun Jonah. Heat and fire bit his shoulder like a hot iron. He stumbled back 2 steps and caught the jam with his good hand. The Spencer slid and fell. He got inside and slammed the door with his hip. Down, he said. The word came out a growl. Mara was already on her knees at the west slit. Smoke from the first shot crawled the ceiling and hung in a thin sheet. She could taste salt and sulfur. The weight of the rifle cut into her bruised shoulder. She saw a shift of shadow where the trees thickened to the creek. The 5th man had taken cover behind a pine with bark that split in plates. His hat line showed. His hands moved, reloading. She did not think about his face. She put the sight on the middle of that place where a man is the biggest and pressed the trigger until it broke. The Winchester kicked. The report filled the cabin until there was no room left for fear. In the trees, a high sound tore out of a throat that had not planned to make it. A body slapped into snow and brush. The men in the open swore. One pulled the wounded man by his collar and left a groove in the drift. Hale fired twice at the door and hit wood. Splinters jumped. Mara worked the lever and fired again into the place where someone had been and might still be. She pulled, breathed, fired. The wall thudded with return shots that did not find her because she was behind a seam in the logs and the house was older than bullets. "Hold," Jonah said. His breath came quick. He tore his coat away with his right hand. Blood had bloomed through flannel and leather. The world had gone bright around the edges. He set his shoulder against the wall and used it to stand because his legs had decided they might not be friends. He checked the Colt with fingers that were sure and set it on the table where his palm could find it. Outside, Hale swore again. Back, he shouted, "Get him up! Back out of the draw!" Horses came around and pushed into the trees. Hooves cut old crust and found mud. A man groaned and then bit it off. The jingle of a bit told the truth more than voices did. They went the way they had come, not in order, not in panic either, but in the half-run of men who do not like the math they have been given. Silence did not come at once. It failed a few times and then found a place. The wire on the ridge had no song in this quiet. The stove ticked and popped as sap cooked in the oak. Smoke laid itself thin against the rafters and did not move. Mara let the muzzle down slow. Her hands shook so that the wood blurred in her grip. She tasted metal. She swallowed it and looked over her shoulder. Jonah had sunk to the floor with his back on the wall. His left arm did not answer. Blood ran from the hole it had found high near the shoulder and made a river down his ribs. The color of it on the dirt was wrong. He looked at her as if the room had lost some of its corners and he needed her to hold one in place. "They gone," he said. His voice was smaller than she had heard it. "They are," she said. It was true. He let his head tip and then jerked it back up. He did not like the angle the world took when he let it go. He breathed the way he had taught her, and failed, and tried again. His face grained until the planes of it all met. Sweat broke along his hairline. She set the Winchester safe and slid on her knees across the floor. She tore at his coat and could not get it free. He tried to help. Pain bit his jaw and shut his eyes for a second. She found the tear in the leather and ripped it with both hands until it gave. She put her fingers on the warm flood and pressed hard. He made a sound that came from somewhere deep. "Stay with me," she said. Her voice held. "Look at me." He did, and it cost him. The stove threw a pulse of red on his face and took it away again. He breathed and watched her mouth, to remember how. Her hands went to the plank by the table. She pulled the rope handle, lifted the board, and found the jar and the bandage where he had placed them. She poured whiskey into the wound, and the room filled with a sharp clean that cut through blood and smoke. He arched and swore and then went white. She packed the cloth against the ruin and leaned her weight into it until the flow slowed. The door latch brightened with light where the sun had climbed. The pressed flower above the stove did not move. Hob pawed once in the lean-to and went quiet. The wire above the ridge held its breath. The house breathed. So did he. So did she. The blood made a dark map on the floor between them, and the smell of it lifted and hung in the heat. The blood slowed under her hands, then surged, then slowed again. The room smelled of iron and whiskey. Steam rose from the kettle and slid along the beam. Mara leaned her weight into the folded cloth and counted with her breath. 5 beats, change the pad. 5 more, change again. Jonah kept his eyes open and fixed them on her face, as if the room would tilt if he looked away. "Stay," she said. "Look at me." He did. His jaw trembled once. Sweat tracked through the soot on his temple. When air left him shallow, she spoke to remind it to return. She poured hot water into a pan and set strips of clean cloth in it. She took the whiskey again and let it run over the wound until he cursed and went white. The sound left him, then came back from farther off. She packed fresh cloth, bound it tight, and tied the knot with her teeth. Outside, the wind turned and lost its teeth. The light at the latch softened. When she raised her head, flakes were falling past the window slit, wide and slow. They landed without sound and piled against the sill. The wire on the ridge went mute under the new weight. The house seemed to fold itself around the two of them and grow small in its care. Jonah's breath turned shallow and quick, then broke to full and rough. Heat poured off his skin and made the fur damp where his shoulder touched it. He closed his eyes without meaning to and tried to open them and could not each time. She set a cool cloth on his forehead and another on his neck. She wrung them in melted snow and changed them when they warmed. The kettle rattled and calmed. The stove heart glowed and held. "Drink," she said. He swallowed willow bark tea and made a face like a child. She tilted the cup again. When he choked, she pulled it away and wiped his mouth with the edge of the sheet. His lips were the color of ash. His good hand found the blanket and held it like a rope. He began to talk without knowing he did. Words came broken and out of order. Names. A field that he had plowed with a borrowed team. A line on a map that turned to a river when a boy stood on it too long. Caleb. The sound of it tore in his throat. "No," Mara said. She put her hands on either side of his face and turned him back to her. "Not the boy. Me. It is me." His eyes cleared for a breath. He saw her, and the room steadied a small degree. She lowered her head until her brow touched his and stayed there, sharing air. "You promised to stand," she said, simple and plain. "Stand now." Time fell into small tasks. She boiled water until the pan sang. She tore the last of her extra linen into strips and rolled them tight. She cleaned the wound again, packed it again, wrapped it again. She spooned broth into him cold enough that it would not turn his stomach. She balled her hands and pressed them into the knot in her back and went on. When she faltered, she looked at the small things. The spoon he had carved warm where it rested on the hearth. The pressed white flower on the open page above the stove, clean as a star in a winter sky. She tugged the blanket over his feet, then over his chest, then over her own knees where the cold found them. The snow fell hard and patient. The eaves dripped and then froze. The yard filled to the lip of the door. The lean-to went still. Hob shifted once and went quiet. The world outside became a closed fist. Near dawn of the second day, the fever climbed to a place that stole his breath. His skin went hot and dry as a skillet. His eyes turned glass. His mouth moved with no sound. She stripped the blanket off his chest and set ice cloth after ice cloth there, waiting for each to warm, changing it before it could. She said his name in a steady voice to give him a path. She told him things that did not belong to fear. "We will put flowers on his grave," she said, "red and yellow. I will sew the curtain straight. You will laugh at the way I always leave one thread long. We will name the child, Michael. Hear me, Michael Rook." His breath hitched, then found a rough rhythm. His lashes trembled. He coughed, and the sound was wet and painful and good. Heat broke and slicked his skin. He sagged under her hands and slept like a man gone deep into a well. She sat back on her heels and shook. The cloth in her hand fell to the floor and made a dark print where it landed. She bent, picked it up, dunked it, wrung it again. The work did not end because the fever had turned. It only changed its face. She washed him with small strokes that did not punish the wound. She poured water and wiped and poured again. When he stirred, she spoke. When he slept, she read the room for what needed doing and did it. She kept the stove in breath and the pot near a boil, and her thoughts near the ground where a person can walk. Snow softened to a sift. The light in the window cracked and showed the shape of the nearest tree. The wire found a small, quiet voice and held it as if the world was remembering to talk. Boots sounded in the yard when the drift would take a step without complaint. Hooves clinked. Harness sounded as it had 3 days before, but with more weight and less hurry. Jonah's eyes opened a slit. Mara stood, wiped her hands on her skirt, and took the Winchester from the wall. She moved to the slit and looked. Blue. A line of men in coats the color of the sky you get after a storm. The one in front carried himself like he knew what he had come to do and did not require thanks for doing it. "House," the man called. "Marshal Amon Pike, coming in." Mara set the rifle on the table and lifted the bar. She opened the door to a white that had softened at the edges. The marshal stepped into the heat and took off his hat. His mustache was heavy and neat. His eyes were not. He looked once and saw what mattered. The barricade at the door, the scars and the logs from bullets. The woman with a clear gaze and a belly round under a dress gone thin at the seams. The man on the floor with a fresh bandage and a face both stubborn and tired. The cradle that had never held a child and already knew its work. Rook Pike said, "You hold." Jonah got his feet under him because pride reached farther than blood loss. He stood with the wall at his shoulder and nodded. He did not salute. He kept his hands where a man could see them. "They came on to my claim," he said. 4 in the open, 1 in the creek line. They drew. We answered. Pike listened, while his eyes went to places the words pointed. He looked at the slit in the west wall. He looked at a smear of blood at knee height that told him where a body had fallen. He looked at the way the table and stool made an honest cover. He rubbed his thumb along the brim of his hat and then set it on the peg beside the door without asking. "Man in Gilt Creek with a broken leg told a story in a saloon," Pike said. Said he was dragged off a ridge by his friends with a hole in his thigh and an idea who put it there. Another man with a nose for coin tried to sell me a direction. Changed his mind when he heard about the hole. Said he never saw a thing. We have heard both sides of a lie. He took a folded paper from his coat. He read the name at the top and the words that tied a person to a debt. The paper crackled. He held it to the stove seam without ceremony. The heat browned it in a heartbeat and turned a corner to lace. He tore it once and then once more and let the pieces fall into the ash pan. I do not much care for writs that smell like a man's will and not the law, he said. Far as my office is concerned, this is self-defense on a man's land. This woman is not property. You will hear no knock from me on that matter. Mara let out a breath she did not know she was holding. She put a hand to the chair back to steady a body that had worked too long in a small circle. Pike turned toward her. Mom, he said the word plain and respectful. You will want to keep that rifle where you can reach it. Barnaby Sloane has lost ground in court. Men like him hire bad ideas when paper fails. I have to ride a wide circle. I cannot stand watch at your door. We will stand, she said. Pike looked back to Jonah and nodded once, as one man does to another when he has taken a measure he respects. He put his hat on, lifted the bar with care, and stepped out into the white. The blue coats turned their mounts and left the yard without marking the cabin with their eyes. The snow took their tracks and filled them only part way. Mara closed the door. She dropped the bar and leaned her forehead against the wood a moment. The house held. The stove breathed. The pressed flour on the mantel did not stir. She crossed the room and knelt by Jonah. His face had color now where there had been none. The line of pain had eased at his mouth. His good hand found hers and stayed. Law says we are here, she said. We are here. He closed his eyes and let his head fall back a little. The breath that went out came in again without being told. Outside, the snow made a soft sound where it slid off the eaves and fell. Inside, the spoon on the hearth was warm to touch. The cradle waited beside the chair and made a promise without a word. Night turned the snowfields to silver. The creek spoke in a soft run. Light from the window lay across the floor in a pale strip you could step over. Mara woke with a low sound in her throat and a grip on the blanket that would not open. Jonah, she said, it is time. He was up with both feet under him. The room moved into its places. Water on, cloths laid out. The kettle took the heat and began to talk. He set his bad arm in its sling without looking at it. He pressed his palm to the small of her back and felt the muscle go, like a rope stretched tight. Breathe with me, he said. In, hold, out. She nodded and lost the nod to a wave that climbed her spine and pulled her belly into a knot. The first pain passed and left a wake of fear that wanted to fill the room. He kept his voice steady. He kept count and let her borrow it. The moon went higher. The clock that had never been wound ticked only when the stove sighed. Mara stood through the first hours with her hands on the edge of the table and her forehead there too. When the table shook, he took her shoulders and turned her away from it and set her on the cot. He folded a blanket to fit under her hips. He wiped her face when sweat ran to her ear. He gave her willow bark and she spat and then took it. The next wave took the breath out of her body and wrung sound from it. She broke the sound off with her teeth and growled. He set his good hand in hers and let her crush it. The room smelled of pine and iron and a sour that meant work done by the living. Look at me, he said when her eyes hunted the ceiling and found nothing there. She looked and found his face and stayed. The pains came regular and then far apart and then close and brutal. He rounded her back with his hand. He rubbed the place where the contraction built until he felt it go. He counted her breath into the rise and out of it. The chair rocked without anyone in it. The cradle waited where he had placed it. He boiled linen strips and hung them on the peg until steam left them. He laid clean cloth on the table. He checked the knife and did not need it. He warmed a strip of oil in his palms and set it where muscle needed help. He did not say he was afraid. His mouth said simple things she could step on, as if they were the stones in a river. Good, he said when she bore down. Again. Morning found edges on things. The window turned from silver to pale milk. Birds gave a few notes and then forgot to sing. The wire on the ridge hummed in a key the creek did not know. Mara cried out and then shook her head and bit off the rest. Her hands cramped and then opened and then cramped again. She cursed the walls and him and her own bones. He took it and let the words go through him into the floor. I cannot, she said once sharp as broken glass. You can, he said. You are. One more and then you breathe. Then one more. She bore down and the room narrowed to a point. The world turned to heat and pressure and a ring of fire that wanted to split her apart. She cried with her whole body and the sound made the rafters listen. Jonah's voice ran under it like a low line you could not shake off. You are here, he said. I have you. At last the pressure changed shape. She felt stretch and then release. She heard her own breath and then another sound, thin and furious and pure. Jonah's hands were there. He lifted wet weight and set it on a clean square of deerskin. He wiped a mouth and nose with a twist of cloth, and the cry sharpened. His big fingers moved like he had found a fragile bird in a trap. "It is a boy," he said. The words came out like he had not meant to put them into the air. He laid the baby on her chest. The child's skin was the color of clay where blood had not reached yet. His hair lay dark and flat. His eyes opened and were a deep, clear gray that did not fix on anything and seemed to take in everything. He was all edges and then no edges at all, a bundle of soft that made the house feel larger and smaller in the same beat. Mara laughed and cried with the same breath. She ran a shaking finger down the tiny arm and felt the power in a muscle no bigger than a bean. The baby rooted and found her skin, and the world went quiet enough to hear the stove breathe. "Michael," she said. "Michael Rook." Jonah sat on the edge of the cot and watched with his mouth open and then closed. His face went strange and soft. He set a rough finger to the baby's palm. The hand closed around it like it knew the shape. Jonah made a sound in his throat that had no name and all names at once. He closed his eyes and opened them again. He took a breath that filled the room. They cleaned and slept in pieces. When the child dozed, Mara drifted into the kind of sleep that has dreams but no story. Jonah moved like a man at worship. He washed the linens and hung them by the stove. He emptied water and filled it again. He checked the yard out of habit and found it as it had been. He laid the chair nearer the cot so a hand on the arm could reach the cradle. By afternoon, the baby slept in the cradle with one arm out of the wrap. The chair rocked to a slow human rhythm. Mara hummed under her breath and did not hear herself. Jonah ran a cloth along the Spencer's barrel and set it back on its pegs and did not see it as a weapon but as a tool that had a place. The days that followed blurred and stood out. The child taught the room a new clock. Feed, sleep, air, feed again. The spoon Jonah had carved lived by the hearth and learned to carry broth. He burned a line under the bowl with his thumb from holding it, where steam could not burn the mouth it fed. When they went to Gilt Creek, the sky was clean, and the wind ran over the grass with no bite in it. The trail lay brown where snow had been. Jonah led Hob. Mara sat the mule with Michael in her arms, wrapped in a soft deer skin that still held the smell of the wild it had come from. The wire made its high line above them to say the world was noisy farther on. A train whistle lifted thin from the valley and fell again. Men turned their heads when they came into town. The blacksmith put down his hammer and nodded. The boy at the pump stared at the baby, and then at Mara, and then at Jonah, and opened his mouth and shut it again. The woman at the mercantile door lifted a hand, and did not wave, but did not hide. The marshal's office held a shadow in the window that could have been Pike and could have been someone else. No one stopped them. They traded pelts for flour, and coffee, and a tin of salt. Jonah took the barrels as if they belonged to him. Mara eased Michael in her arms, and let him sleep through the noise as if it were part of a song. They were strapping the flour to Hobbs' pack saddle when Barnaby Sloane stepped out of the saloon into the white of the street. His vest was fine cloth, with stains at the edges. His collar hung open. His eyes were red at the rims. Whiskey sat on his breath like hot sugar gone wrong. He saw the three of them and stopped as if he had stepped off into water he had not noticed. "Mara," he said. It came out small, then pride woke and fattened it. "You took what is mine." Jonah moved without hurry and put his body between them with the handle of Hobbs' lead rope still in his hand. "She is not yours," he said. Sloane laughed, and it broke in the middle. He moved a step sideways to see around Jonah. His gaze landed on the cradle blanket in Mara's arms and stuck there. His mouth twisted as if he had tasted tin. "That child," he said. "You think you can hide him from a ledger. You think you can change ink with air. The papers say he is mine by law." Mara's voice was clear. "He is not." Sloane's hand shot out for her sleeve. Jonah caught the wrist before it closed. He did not squeeze. He held it where it was and looked at the man it belonged to. Sloane tried to step closer. Jonah let go of the rope and set his fist into the place under the man's ear with all the weight of winter and work behind it. Something in Sloane's jaw made a sound that belonged in a butcher's room. He went down on the packed street and lay with one hand on his mouth and the other on the mud. He blinked like a man who sees more than one sky. The town took a breath. No one moved. The blacksmith wiped his hands on his apron and looked at Jonah with his head a little to the side as if to see better. The boy at the pump took a step and then another back. The woman at the mercantile put both hands on the doorframe and hung there. A dog stopped in the middle of the crossing and stood with one foot lifted. Jonah looked down at Sloane and then up at the awning and then at Mara. His hand opened and closed once as if checking that it was real. He took the lead rope and put it in his other hand. He did not look to see if Sloane would get up. "You had your chance," he said. "She chose." Sloane breathed through his mouth and blinked hard. His hat lay in the mud next to his head. He did not reach for it. He looked up at Mara and saw nothing that would help him. He looked at the baby and flinched and could not have said why. Jonah lifted the pack saddle tight with a last jerk and tied it off. He set the coffee in the sack where it would not strike the flour. He put the tin of salt in the side bag. He checked the cinch with one hand. He raised his eyes to the faces along the street and then put them back on Mara and the child. "Ready," he said. She nodded. She had not stepped back. Michael slept with his mouth open a little and his fist at his cheek. She set the deerskin higher on his shoulder and met Jonah's eyes. He took Hobbs' lead and walked. She kept the mule straight with her knees and let the town fall behind them. The trail up out of Gilt Creek was the same as it had been. Ruts, stones, a place where the creek came close. A gate a man had made out of poles and wire and did not finish. The wire above the ridge sang. The train whistled once out in the valley, and then there was only the sound of the mule's hooves and the slow run of the creek. Jonah's shoulders set to a line that belonged to a man headed home. The chair and the cradle waited where they had been left. The fire would need feeding. The door would need closing. The three of them made a shape that fit the trail and did not ask permission of it. Morning came soft and clean. The smoke from the pipe rose straight for a time before the breeze found it. The creek ran full and brown, shouldering small sticks toward the bend. A wren fussed in the brush and then thought better of it. Light fell in a square on the table and moved slow across the floor. Jonah tested his shoulder by lifting the water bucket with his good hand and steadying the weight with the other. The scar pulled. It did not argue as it had. He set the bucket down and listened to the house. Heat at the stove, breath in the small bundle in the cradle, the knit of wood that said the walls were settled and right. He stepped outside with a coil of peeled aspen poles on his shoulder. The yard was awash of wet soil and early shoots. He sank a post at the corner, where the path turned toward the lean-to, and set another 12 paces along. He sighted down the line, drove stakes, and ran rails in a low run that marked the yard without penning it. The fence made a square that held nothing but the idea of home. Mara stood on the stoop with Michael tucked in a sling against her chest. She had the spoon in her apron pocket, the one with the flour cut into the handle. She watched Jonah set another crosspiece and lift it into place with a grunt and a small nod when it held. The shovel cut the earth in clean slabs that smelled like rain and iron. The rails took their seats and quieted. "Not high," she said. "Enough," he said. "Let's the world know where the door is." She stepped down into the yard. The ground took her weight and gave a little. She knelt by a plot beside the creek that had been turned shallow. She pushed a furrow with the heel of her hand and dropped a bead of seed along it and covered it with a sweep of her palm. Carrots first, then beans, then a short row that would be potatoes when the time was right. She pressed her fingers into the damp and felt life move as if it had turned in sleep. Jonah finished the last section of rail and hung his hat on a post. He came to the plot and set a row straight with a line of twine tied to 2 sticks. He held one while she placed the other and drew the string tight. The sun warmed the back of his neck. A fly worried at his ear and went away. The wire above the ridge sang a thin song that did not reach the ground here. Later, he brought the small box from the shelf by the door. It was a tin that had once held tea. Inside were seeds Caleb had saved in a twist of paper and a few he and Mara had traded for in town. He poured a pinch into his palm, and the things looked like nothing at all. She picked one with the point of her nail and set it in the place it wanted. They worked down the row with their heads bent and shoulders nearly touching. In the afternoon, Mara took a piece of flour sack and the red thread she had saved. She sat by the window and stitched small flowers along the hem of the curtain. Trillium 3 petals and a center that needed only a touch. Light came through the cloth and found the red, and the color held in it like a song that stays after the voice is gone. When she was done, she shook the curtain, and the room looked more like a room that had been asked to welcome and had agreed. Jonah shaved a sliver from a board and checked the edge of the cradle. He had noticed a roughness that could catch. He smoothed it until his palm found only the long grain and the shine of oil. He set the wedge back under one rocker and pressed it in with his thumb. The chair near it needed nothing. It knew its work. Toward evening, they climbed the slope behind the house. The grass there came early where the wind had stripped the snow. The pile of stones that marked Caleb had settled over winter and had held. Mara knelt and set the roots of 3 small plants in a ring, one with red heads, one with yellow, one white with a green center. She pressed the soil firm around them and brushed her dirty hand on her skirt without thinking. Jonah stood with his hands in his pockets and his boots a finger short of touching the stones. He had nothing in his mouth worth saying to the ground. He watched her plant and the shovel curl out the shape of a shallow bowl that would catch rain. She looked up. He nodded once. The wind up here ran cooler and smelled of rock and dry grass. The sun sat on the far ridge and made the wire gleam like a hair in the light. They went down slow, carrying the shovel between them. The fence caught the last of the day and threw a thin line of shadow across the yard. The mule stood at the gate and watched as if the rails had a word for him he did not know. Supper was beans and bread and a slice of dried apple that had somehow not been eaten in winter. Mara fed Michael and leaned back in the chair without thinking about it. The rock came sweet and even. The crib creaked once in answer. Jonah poured coffee and added a thin thumb of milk and carried it to her in both hands so it would not slop. She took the cup and let the steam bathe her face. The smell of it went into her and eased something tight behind her eyes. "Wind is rough," she said. "We are as tough as wood," he said. She smiled at that. "And warm," she said, and put her hand on his wrist. "When there is fire." He touched the back of her hand with a finger as if to check it. The room held them easy. Nothing pushed at the door. The stove made its low animal sound, and the pot sighed and went quiet. They went to town twice more that month. There were places where the trail had seen too much melt and gave under a hoof with a sound like breath leaving. Jonah walked there and let Hob find different ground. The blacksmith nodded and spoke a few plain words about a hinge that would need looking at. The woman at the mercantile handed Mara a spool of thread and did not wait for coin until the flour had been weighed. The marshal, if it was him behind the glass, had his hat on the desk and his boots up. No one asked questions worth anger. No one said, "Sloan." The train threw a whistle high and thin, and that was the loudest thing. Back at the cabin, the days stacked into a wall that held. Jonah fixed the hinge on the gate. He brought chips in for kindling and set them in a basket by the stove. He hung a strip of deer hide above the rafters where the warm would dry it slow. He took the Spencer down, oiled it, and put it back without looking at it long. His hand went to the axe more than it went to the gun now. Mara scrubbed the table and found a scratch there she had not put. She wiped it with a damp cloth and knew it would stay. She washed the curtain and hung it back. She learned where the sun bit through the window and moved the cradle a handspan so the light would warm Michael without laying on his eyes. She put the spoon by the cup without looking at it to place it. She sang when the house was quiet and did not mind if no one heard. There were hard days. Michael had a fever that came fast and went with cloths and worry. Jonah woke from a sleep that had been deep and true, with his heart set to a gallop and sweat cold at his neck. He sat up and found the room and the sounds and the faces and let the breath leave him slow. The fence lost a rail in a blow that ran across the range for 2 days and left the yard full of needles and cones and the smell of wet pitch. The creek swelled twice and then found itself again. On a morning with a cool edge at its back, they walked the fence line. Jonah carried the hammer and a pocket of bent nails. Mara carried Michael and showed him the small things, a beetle with green light in its shell, a feather caught in the grass, the way moss finds the north side of a post. The boy reached with a fist and opened it and seemed surprised that the world did not stay in his hand. They came to the place where the rails met and made a corner that faced the slope. The view widened there. The wire on the ridge cut the sky. The path up from town showed as a pale scrape, where wheels had taken the top off the soil. In the far distance, a horse moved along a fence that was not theirs and then vanished behind scrub. No one came toward them. The sound they heard was their own. They stood a while and did not talk. The breeze touched the hair at Mara's temple. Jonah took the boy for a time and set him against his chest and felt the weight. Michael let out a small sound and burrowed as if he knew the shape of the place he had been given. Jonah looked down and saw the fist loosen, and the eyes close, and his mouth softened into something that was his and only here. They turned back when the sun reached the post with the hat notch. The chair waited in the shade. The cradle kept its slow breath. The pressed flower on the mantel held its white. The tin where the letter had lived stayed empty and did not ask for new paper. The house knew the steps that would come and made room for them. In the last light, Jonah sat with Michael on his knee. The boy's small hand closed in his beard and would not let go. The pain of it was nothing. He rocked a small rock that matched the rhythm of the creek. Mara stood by the stove and watched their two shadows reach up the log wall and fold in at the ceiling when the fire lowered. She put a hand to the kettle and felt the heat there and set it a little to the side. The smoke from the pipe went straight for a long breath before the breeze found it. The wire above the ridge made a faint line. The night came in without argument. Inside the house, the heat stayed where it should. The spoon on the hearth was warm. The fence held. The seeds waited. The water talked to itself and then rested. The three of them filled the space and did not crowd it. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.